For this next video exercise, we will be painting a still life using tints of chromatic black. To get started, find two interesting still life objects to paint and set them up on a table or other surface near your painting setup. Consider using one object that's lighter in value and another that's darker. You may want to directly light your still life so that it has maximum contrast. One goal of this exercise will be to identify how light affects the layers of value on your objects. All three-dimensional objects have the following layers of light and shadow: highlights, midtones, core shadows, and cast shadows. These layers correlate to how close or far away they are from the light source. The highlight is generally the closest layer to the light source, followed by the midtones and the core shadow. The cast shadow is the farthest away from the light source, casting the shape of the object on the surface below or behind it. When you make your painting, you will visualize the shapes of value that correlate to these different layers of light and shadow. Go ahead and tape a new sheet of canvas paper to your painting board. Your painting setup will be the same as before, but with a full range of brushes this time. As with last time, you'll be using the paint colors Burnt Umber, Ultramarine Blue, and Titanium White. Now mix some more neutral chromatic black or take out your pre-mixed batch. Make a fairly large batch of this so you don't need to keep mixing it. The first thing I'm going to do is paint a color for the background. Look at your still life setup and estimate the value of the background in gray. You can literally hold your value scale up to it if it helps you estimate. Is it on the lighter or darker side of the scale? Mine seems to be on the lighter middle of the scale, which I'll estimate at around 30% gray. Use one of your wider brushes, like your 1-inch flat brush, to fill the surface of the painting. Make this paint somewhat fluid with water or matte medium. By painting the background first, you're creating a ground of paint that the subsequent layers sit upon. The painted foreground objects will literally sit on that ground, which makes the illusion of space all the more real. Your ground shouldn't be so thin that it's streaky, but it shouldn't be too thick either, as you want to leave room for additional layers of paint. You can see that my page is already starting to warp a bit under the weight of the painted ground, so I'm going to add some more painter's tape reinforcement across the edges. Next, estimate base values for your two objects. I'll estimate that the apple in my still life is roughly 20% gray and that the hat is around 60%. Mix those corresponding tints on your palette and rough out the shapes of the objects on your painting. Try to paint these shapes large enough so that they take up the majority of your composition. It's okay if they touch the edges of the page or even extend beyond the borders. It's better too big than too small. Think about the individual shapes that make up your objects. My hat, for instance, is made up of a semi-sphere for the cap and a half cylinder for the bill. This application of paint should be about as fluid as the background layer. If you have to correct the edges of the shapes later, thinner surfaces are easier to paint over than thicker ones. Keep thinking in terms of shapes instead of lines. There should be no visible outlines around your objects because outlines don't exist around objects in the real world. The human eye can differentiate even the slightest shift between two values that make up an edge. In a painting, outlines flatten the three-dimensionality of your images, making them look less real. Now let's work on defining the darkest shadows. This is a good place to start because it establishes contrast in your painting. Identify where the core shadows are in your objects and estimate how dark each object gets in these places. Remember, the core shadows on your objects are generally the farthest away from your light source, where it literally takes light the longest to travel. Mix darker values for these areas and paint the shapes of value that you observe. Any curve or crease in the surface of your objects is also where you can expect to find these darker shadows. Notice how I keep looking back at my still life objects as I paint. Get in the habit of doing this yourself, as it ensures you are directly observing what's in front of you and not having to invent too much. It's kind of like checking your answer in a math problem. Next, add in the midtones. These are the shapes of value in the range that's between shadows and highlights. This is where the most value range tends to be found on the painting, so take some time as you establish the shapes of value for your midtones. Consider using thicker paint as you get through this layer. It's okay to paint through where you know the highlights will go, because they can sit right on top of this midtone layer. Now's a good time to work back into the background and build this layer up a bit thicker. Each transparent layer of paint that you add makes the surface a little more opaque. From here, add the cast shadows below or behind your objects. These are always found on the opposite side of the object from the light source. Cast shadows are also found where your objects meet the surface below. Cast shadows are often the darkest parts of your composition, so don't be afraid to exaggerate these values slightly for a dramatic effect. Again, you can use the position of your light to change the shape and intensity of your cast shadows. In my still life, the apple is casting a shadow that runs across the ground and onto the hat behind it. Now it's time to add the highlights to your objects. These are the lightest values on your objects and are generally found closest to your light source. Try to be sparing with the brightest spots. Not all objects will have areas of absolute white. By adding highlights, you've created the full range of value for your objects. I recommend using the thickest paint for your highlights so that they physically sit above the other layers. One tip is that cool colors appear to recede in a painting while warm colors appear to emerge. Consider tinting your shadow mixture slightly cool and your highlight mixtures slightly warm to achieve this effect. Finally, take a look at your painting as a whole. Do you see any areas that need to be refined? Are there any details or shapes of value that are missing? Try to push the existing contrast a bit further between your shadows and highlights. Adding very thin layers to the surface can be a good strategy for these final touches. Don't be afraid to use your finger or a cloth to add some soft smudges to the surface. You can also add some reflected light to the edges of your objects for extra dimensionality. Congrats! This takes us to the end of the exercise.